Rosalind Parker was 72 years old when she first laid eyes on Greenwood Valley Farm in its state of abandonment. 10 years had passed since her husband, Howard, died suddenly, leaving her with a modest life insurance payout and a heart still tender from grief. For the past decade, she had lived alone in the small suburban house they once shared, its walls haunted by memories. Yet for reasons she could not fully articulate, Rosalind found herself drawn to this aging property. Perhaps it was the echo of childhood visits to a distant relative who once lived in the region. Or perhaps it was the nagging feeling that she had little time left to embark on the kind of bold adventure people dream of but rarely attempt in later years. Greenwood Valley Farm, with its boarded-up windows and overgrown fields, felt like both a risk and a calling. She had discovered it in the local paper, a tiny ad about a foreclosed farm coming up for auction. The mention of its 18th century foundations and expansive lavender fields reminded her of days long gone, afternoons spent in a simpler era, when she would run through meadows behind her grandparents' home. The photograph in the paper, though grainy and unflattering, hinted at the graceful lines of a once stately farmhouse. A memory she had never quite let go stirred inside her, the distant smell of lavender in the air, the laughter of grown-ups sipping lemonade on a wide porch. The neighbors, most of them younger families, shook their heads when they learned of her plan. Surely a woman of her age had no business purchasing a large, run-down property. Weren't the burdens of upkeep alone going to be overwhelming? And what of the finances? Rosalind had listened politely, but was unmoved by their concerns. She had lived for others her entire life, raising two children who were now scattered across the country, working decades as a librarian to support her husband's dream of opening his own photography studio. She had doted on her grandchildren whenever they visited, though those visits were increasingly rare. Now, however, she felt an inner voice urging her to take a chance. Perhaps it was the quiet after Howard's passing, or the sense that time was slipping away faster than she had anticipated. The day of the auction, she arrived wearing her best pressed slacks, sensible shoes, and a pastel blue cardigan that brought out the silver in her hair. The county official's eyes widened slightly when Rosalind produced the letter of credit backed by her husband's insurance and her own carefully saved pension fund. She left the room that afternoon as the unexpected new owner of Greenwood Valley Farm, spending nearly every cent she had. When she finally set foot on the property, the house loomed before her like a grand old dame fallen on hard times. The porch steps sagged, and every shutter was askew. The wind rustled through dead leaves piled in corners, and a sense of forlorn isolation clung to the air. Yet standing there under the wide sky, Rosalind felt something like hope. She closed her eyes and imagined what it might look like, restored a place alive with the scent of lavender and the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. In that moment, she decided this would be her final project, a legacy she could leave behind that was entirely her own. The day she moved in was cold and gray, the kind of late autumn chill that hinted at the winter to come. Rosalind stood in the dusty front hall, a single suitcase at her feet, and gazed at the cavernous space. Her breath caught, half with excitement and half with trepidation. It was eerily quiet except for the occasional creak of old floorboards. The electricity had only just been reconnected, so she flipped the brass switch by the door and watched a single overhead bulb sputter to life, casting long shadows on the chipped wallpaper. She had prepared for this moment as best she could, but the reality was humbling. There was no central heat, just two ancient fireplaces that likely hadn't been used in decades. Water pipes needed checking, windows needed replacing, and a good portion of the roof would have to be repaired before the first real snow. As she wandered the downstairs rooms, Rosalind jotted notes in a small ledger. Replace front doorknobs, check basement for leaks, call electrician, rewiring. Dangerous. Even so, she paused now and then to let her hand rest on a dusty mantel or run over the intricately carved banister. There was beauty here, hidden beneath layers of grime. While exploring the old dining room, she heard a gentle knock at the front door. Opening it, she found a tall, lanky man in his late 70s, wearing a brown jacket and a weary smile. "Afternoon," he said, nodding politely. "I'm Frank Whitmore. I live just a ways down the road. Used to do some handyman work here a long time ago. In his weathered hands, he held a small tin of freshly baked cookies. Thought you might like these. Figured you haven't had time to shop yet. Grateful for a friendly face, Rosalind invited him in. She offered him the only chair not covered in a sheet or dust. They sat together in the front hall, sharing sugar cookies and stories of how Greenwood Valley had once been the pride of the county. Frank had known the last official owners, the Caldwell family, though that was decades ago. Edith Caldwell was an extraordinary lady, he recalled, smart as a whip. She took off one day, back in the 50s. A lot of rumors about what happened to her, but no one ever knew for sure. This reference to a mysterious disappearance piqued Rosalind's curiosity. What do you mean, took off, she asked, her librarian instincts kicking in. Frank shrugged. Folks said she either ran away or fell victim to foul play. Some blame financial troubles. Others say she discovered something dark about the family business. Her grandson Andrew spent his whole life trying to figure out what happened to her. But he vanished, too, about 5 or 6 years back, just left without a word. That evening, as Rosalind lit a fire in the old stone fireplace for warmth, her mind kept returning to Frank's story. She wondered if the estate held any trace of Edith Caldwell, or if Andrew had left behind some clue. Old houses like this often contained hidden corners, lost letters, or diaries. She sensed a quiet allure in the thought of uncovering them. In the flickering glow, she made a silent promise to treat this place with care and respect, to honor the stories embedded in its walls. A swirl of wind rattled the window panes, and she pulled a thin blanket around her shoulders, heart beating with both apprehension and anticipation of the chapter she was about to write in her own life. For the first week, Rosalind focused on practical tasks, hiring a local roofer to patch leaks, bringing in an electrician to confirm the house wouldn't burn down if she plugged in a vacuum, and arranging for a plumber to restore the battered pipes. Throughout these mundane chores, her mind would drift back to the Caldwell family, especially when she encountered old photographs still hanging on walls that hadn't been stripped bare. One afternoon, while moving boxes in an upstairs hallway, she found a framed newspaper clipping dated 1952, local heiress, Edith Caldwell, to expand lavender operations. The article showed a poised young woman standing in a field of lavender, wearing a bright smile. Rosalind wondered if that woman had ever imagined her life would end in mystery. She called Frank over for lunch a few days later, curious to learn more. They sat in the dusty kitchen, sharing sandwiches and coffee. Through the cracked window, they could see the neglected fields that had once been the Caldwell Lavender Farm. Those fields were a sight to behold back then, Frank mused, voice tinged with nostalgia. People would come from all over just to walk among the rows of purple. Edith was an innovator. Some said she even bred her own hybrid variety, one with a darker hue and a richer scent. Later, Rosalind ventured outside to see the fields for herself. The rows were barely discernible, choked by weeds and tall grass, but here and there, hardy clusters of lavender still clung to life, leaves gray-green and resilient. She knelt and crumbled some dried stalks between her fingers. The faint fragrance that emerged felt like a whisper from the past. Her heart squeezed at the thought of neglected beauty waiting to be revived, much as she herself was seeking a second wind in this latter stage of life. That night, a thunderstorm descended upon Greenwood Valley, rattling the old house. Rain pounded against the walls, and the wind howled across the neglected estate. Rosalind took a flashlight to check for leaks. She noticed water trickling down one corridor in the west wing, a part of the house she hadn't explored thoroughly yet. Carefully, she stepped over puddles and followed the drip, shining the beam of light along the peeling wallpaper until she found the source, a crack in the ceiling. She dragged a bucket from a nearby storage room to catch the water. When she returned, the flashlight beam flickered over an oddly uneven section of the wall. The pattern of the wallpaper didn't align quite right, and she saw a faint outline that looked suspiciously like the edge of a doorway. Her pulse quickened. Was it a closet, or something more unusual? She pressed her palm against the section, half expecting nothing to happen. To her astonishment, the panel gave way slightly. Heart thumping, she pushed, and a hidden door swung open, revealing a narrow flight of stairs descending into darkness. The smell of stale air rushed out. With the rain still hammering overhead, Rosalind stood at the threshold, her flashlight wavering over the stone steps. She felt that same mixture of intrigue and caution she once experienced when opening a rare archival box in her librarian days. After a moment's hesitation, she resolved to see what lay below. Steadying herself against the damp wall, she began her descent, unprepared for the secrets that awaited her in the hidden room beneath Greenwood Valley Farm. The stone steps led to a cramped corridor that felt carved out of the farmhouse's foundation. Each step carried Rosalind further from the howling storm outside into an underground hush that pressed on her ears. It was cooler here, the air tinged with must and something akin to old leather. She counted 7 steps before reaching a tiny landing. Ahead, an iron door stood slightly ajar, rusted hinges moaning in protest as she nudged it open. Her flashlight revealed a single small chamber, no bigger than the average walk-in closet. The walls were lined with shelves containing dusty ledgers, boxes, and what appeared to be old letters bound with twine. In one corner stood a rickety desk, its surface cluttered with yellowed papers and a tilted brass lamp. Cobwebs shimmered in the flashlight's glare. Rosalind's heart pounded, and she resisted the urge to cough from the stale air. This was not just a storage room. It felt more like a secret study, carefully sealed off from prying eyes. She stepped inside, mindful of where she placed her feet. Every shelf was a potential trove of history, and her librarian instincts roared to life. She shone her light over the spines of ledgers. Most were dated in the late 1940s or early 1950s, many bearing the Caldwell name. There were folders labeled Lavender Hybrid Research, financial records, and cryptic tags like AWM letters. On the desk, a stack of photographs caught her attention first. Her beam illuminated black and white images of a young woman at various ages, sometimes posed in a neatly pressed dress, sometimes standing in a laboratory-like space with beakers and plant cuttings. The woman was unmistakably Edith Caldwell, but it was the journal that made Rosalind's breath hitch. A slim, leather-bound volume lay partially opened, ribbons marking specific entries. She lifted it gently, her eyes scanning the first page, property of Edith Caldwell, January 1952. The handwriting was neat and purposeful, each line penned in black ink. Unable to resist, she flipped to the last entry, dated June 15, 1952. It mentioned something about confronting a partner named Davis Waring over suspicious financial dealings. Edith wrote of her fear that he might do anything to keep me silent, and that if I don't bring these ledgers to the authorities, no one will ever know the truth. A chill prickled Rosalind's skin. This was no ordinary journal of day-to-day musings. It read like evidence, the final testament of a woman who suspected a grave crime. She kept scanning the pages, discovering sketches of lavender plants annotated with notes on crossbreeding. Edith's mind seemed to toggle between the scientific wonders of horticulture and the grim realization that she was dealing with a dangerous betrayal. Lightning flickered through a small, ground-level window, momentarily illuminating the hidden room without the need for a flashlight. In that flash, Rosalind noticed a trunk beneath the desk. She knelt, heart pounding, and tugged it open. Inside were more folders, some labeled confidential, and a smaller locked box she could not open. Carefully, she placed it atop the desk, vowing to figure out a way to unlock it later. She had never felt more alive, and also more anxious, in her life. This was far beyond any musty manuscript she had ever cataloged in her years as a librarian. With the storm still raging above, Rosalind now realized she might be on the verge of unraveling not just a lost horticultural experiment, but a decades-old mystery involving embezzlement, possible murder, and the disappearance of Edith Caldwell. Closing the journal gently, she stood up. She needed to call Frank and perhaps the police, but a part of her also wanted to guard this secret, to unravel it at her own pace. Torn between caution and curiosity, she climbed back up the stairs, the journal clutched tightly against her chest. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving the farm grounds glistening with rainwater. Rosalind hardly slept, her mind spinning with questions about Edith, Davis Waring, and the hidden ledger records. She fixed a pot of tea in the newly repaired kitchen and gazed out a window at the soggy fields, where patches of lavender stood steadfast against the downpour's aftermath. Before calling anyone, she decided to examine the journal more thoroughly. She set herself up in the dusty library room, where light streamed in through tall windows. Though the shelves were mostly empty now, it felt like the appropriate place to conduct her research. She flipped through the journal's early entries. Edith had been meticulous in documenting her experiments with lavender, crossing a local variety with one from France to achieve a unique color and aroma. Her successes were overshadowed by references to financial irregularities at Caldwell and Waring. One passage described how she stumbled upon suspicious entries in the accounting books, money funneling into shell companies, large amounts unaccounted for, and checks with forged signatures. As the entries progressed, Edith's tone shifted from academic excitement to palpable fear. She wrote about confronting Davis Waring, her business partner, who dismissed her concerns as mistakes. Yet the final entries revealed her conviction that Waring was stealing funds and might have had more sinister ties. "If I don't speak up, no one will," was one of her last lines. After that, the journal ended abruptly. Rosalind felt a sense of responsibility she hadn't known she could bear. Before she could decide her next step, Frank knocked on the door, exactly as she'd hoped. He stepped in, removing his cap with a polite nod. "Just checking to see how you weathered the storm," he said. When Rosalind mentioned the secret door in the hidden room, his eyes widened. She led him there, showing him the trunk, the locked box, and the journal. Frank shook his head in disbelief. "I never knew such a place existed. But if I recall, Andrew Caldwell, Edith's grandson, spent years searching for answers about her. If he knew this room existed, maybe he vanished trying to protect it." They debated calling the sheriff. Frank, a former county deputy in his younger days, insisted they notify the authorities, but Rosalind hesitated. "I'm worried the local real estate forces might swoop in," she explained, aware that if news of hidden valuables or scandalous documents got out, Greenwood Valley Farm could become entangled in a legal quagmire. "Let's at least see what's in that locked box first," she suggested. Frank proved resourceful. He examined the lock and identified it as a simple mechanism that could be picked with a few household items. Within minutes, the box clicked open, revealing a stack of letters and a tarnished key. The letters were from someone named Ronald Pearson, accountant, according to his signature. They detailed exactly how funds were embezzled from Caldwell and Waring, complete with transaction dates and bank routing numbers. At the bottom of the box lay a single photograph, Edith Caldwell, alongside a tall man with a stern expression, presumably Davis Waring, standing in front of the farmhouse's west wing. On the back, in Edith's handwriting, it read, "He must be stopped." "Frank," Rosalind whispered, "this is huge. It's not just a family squabble. This is criminal evidence." She closed the box, hands shaking. "We need to be careful who we trust." They decided to call the sheriff's office later that afternoon. Once they had organized the documents, Sheriff Jacqueline Doyle arrived the next morning in an unmarked car, stepping out into the gravel driveway with a measured gait. She was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes that spoke of experience. Rosalind and Frank greeted her on the porch, and after introductions, they led her to the hidden room. The sheriff took everything in with professional calm, running a gloved hand over the dust-caked ledgers, snapping photos of the trunk's contents, and questioning Rosalind on precisely how she discovered the chamber. She spent a good hour examining the journal and the letters, her brow furrowing as she read, "This is indeed potential evidence in a cold case investigation." She finally said, "Edith Caldwell's disappearance remains unsolved. Officially, she was declared missing, presumed dead, but no one ever found a body or a definitive explanation." When Rosalind mentioned Andrew Caldwell's more recent disappearance, the sheriff nodded. He filed multiple requests with the county for access to certain records about Caldwell and Waring. "We have evidence he believed his grandmother was murdered. Then, about 5 years ago, Andrew himself went off the grid. Some folks claimed he was paranoid or had gone bankrupt. Others whispered darker theories. but no proof ever materialized. Rosalind's heart sank. You think Andrew may have met the same fate as Edith for digging too deep? The sheriff didn't answer directly. Instead, she asked for permission to bring in a forensic team to search the property, particularly the West Wing and surrounding grounds. She also asked if Rosalind had found any signs of remains, or disturbed earth, or anything out of place beyond the hidden room. It's possible Edith's body could be buried somewhere on this estate, especially if Waring or his associates were involved in a crime. She added, that possibility filled Rosalind with dread. This farmhouse, which she had envisioned reviving into a place of beauty, might hold a secret grave. Sheriff Doyle promised discretion, aware that attracting media or curious onlookers would only complicate matters. She told Rosalind to keep the discovery quiet for now, to let the investigation proceed methodically. After the sheriff left, Rosalind and Frank lingered on the porch, neither quite ready to return inside. I'm sorry it's gotten so heavy, Frank offered softly. You came here for a fresh start. Rosalind sighed, looking at the tangle of barren lavender plants in the distance. Sometimes, the past doesn't rest easy, she said. But maybe discovering the truth will set something right for Edith and Andrew and for Greenwood Valley Farm as well. It deserves to be more than just the site of a tragedy. Over the next few days, the sheriff's forensic team scoured the property. Rosalind watched them from the living room window, markers and measuring tapes in hand as they surveyed the grounds. They used ground-penetrating radar in the orchard area and near a weathered statue of an angel, one of the last ornate features left outside. Rumor had it, that angel statue marked the family plot. Sure enough, on the third day, one of the deputies came racing up to the porch, face pale. They had found skeletal remains beneath a patch of disturbed soil behind the angel statue. The entire property was now considered a crime scene. Rosalind felt her knees go weak as she realized what that meant. Edith Caldwell might have been buried here all along, her brilliance in life cut short, concealed under the very ground Rosalind hoped to reclaim. The news of a body discovered on Greenwood Valley Farm spread through the small county like wildfire. Despite Sheriff Doyle's request for discretion, rumors flew, and soon reporters were camped at the Gravel's driveway, hoping for a glimpse of the excavation site. Rosalind found herself confronted by cameras every time she stepped outside. Initially, she tried to stay polite. This was, after all, a shocking story involving a once prominent local family. But as days passed, she retreated indoors, drawing curtains to shield herself from the relentless intrusion. Frank proved to be her buffer, intercepting some of the more persistent journalists and shooing them off the property. At the same time, the forensics team confirmed via preliminary testing that the skeletal remains likely belonged to a woman in her mid-30s to early 40s, an age consistent with Edith Caldwell's profile. Sheriff Doyle cautioned that DNA tests would take more time, but the suspicion was strong enough that they opened a homicide investigation. In the midst of this uproar, a tall man in a tailored suit arrived at the front porch, introducing himself as Leonard Waring. My grandfather was Davis Waring, he explained in a genteel tone. I'm in real estate now, and I was interested in purchasing this property some months ago. It's quite a coincidence that you found something so notable. He made a thin-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. Rosalind immediately felt a chill. The name Waring was scrawled all over Edith's journal as the potential culprit behind embezzlement, and now here was his grandson. Leonard politely offered to take the farm off Rosalind's hands for a fair price, claiming it was too burdensome for someone of her age. He also alluded to the negative publicity that might linger for years if a murder case was pinned to the property's history. She declined. I bought this place to restore it, not to run away at the first sign of trouble, she said, refusing to be intimidated. Leonard left a business card, his expression calculating. He said he would keep in touch. After he left, Rosalind found herself trembling, unsure if it was anger or fear. Frank, who had overheard the exchange from a distance, stepped up with a comforting hand on her shoulder. Watch out for that one, he said. He's got an edge to him. Meanwhile, the forensic team expanded their search. They examined other areas around the farmhouse, including the orchard and old garden plots. An anthropologist was called in to analyze the bones found beneath the angel statue. If confirmed to be Edith Caldwell, the next question was how she died. A deputy confided to Frank that the remains showed definite signs of trauma, as if she had been struck by a heavy object. This was no accidental death. Between the nightly news stories and Waring's unsettling visit, Rosalind felt besieged. Yet she also felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come here to save Greenwood Valley Farm from oblivion, and in doing so, she had stumbled upon a tragedy that demanded justice. She poured her energy into contacting local historians, scouring library archives for any mention of Edith's final days, and continuing to sift through the hidden room's documents. Maybe, just maybe, the evidence she and Frank uncovered could finally bring light to a mystery that had haunted this land for 70 years. Sheriff Doyle's department ramped up the investigation, securing a warrant to search Leonard Waring's offices, suspecting him of trying to conceal historical ties to his grandfather's potential crimes. It turned out that Leonard had long been aware of certain Caldwell and Waring financial documents, but the specifics remained murky. Rumors hinted that Andrew Caldwell, Edith's grandson, had confronted Leonard about them 5 years earlier, shortly before Andrew vanished. For Rosalind, the situation escalated further when she came home one evening from a grocery run to find the farmhouse's back door forced open. She walked in cautiously, heart pounding, and discovered her carefully assembled files scattered across the kitchen floor. Drawers were pulled out, and Edith's journal lay open on a chair as though it had been examined and tossed aside. The locked box of letters was missing. She called Frank immediately, and he arrived in minutes, brandishing an old shotgun he once used for home protection. While they waited for the sheriff, Rosalind fought back tears, anger, and violation coursing through her. Sheriff Doyle arrived, inspecting the damage. There was no sign of forced entry other than the splintered back door, and no footprints in the muddy yard. "Whoever did this knows what they're looking for," Doyle said, frowning at the rummaged documents. That night, Rosalind slept fitfully, half expecting to hear another intruder's footsteps. She realized she could no longer keep a low profile. The farm was at the center of a murder investigation that reached across generations, implicating a powerful family. The evidence discovered in the hidden room was critical to unearthing the truth, and apparently someone was willing to break in to retrieve or destroy it. In the days that followed, a wave of local support rose up around Rosalind. People who recalled the Caldwell family history stopped by, some bringing old photographs or letters that might help piece together Edith's final weeks. A librarian from the county archives arrived with microfilm clippings from 1952 newspapers. Among them, Rosalind found a small article mentioning disturbances at Caldwell and Waring, rumored to involve financial malfeasance. Another clipping documented the launch of Edith's new lavender hybrid, praising it for its deeper hue and exceptional fragrance. But then the coverage abruptly stopped. Amid the ongoing commotion, Rosalind's children, her daughter, Carol, and her son, Keith, phoned with concern. They had only a vague sense of what was happening, gleaned from the news. Both urged her to leave the farm and come somewhere safer. Rosalind, though touched by their worry, refused. She explained that she had become part of something bigger than herself, a legacy of truth that needed to be unearthed. To her surprise, both Carol and Keith seemed to understand in their own way, promising to visit soon, encouraged by this support. Rosalind spoke more openly with Sheriff Doyle, asking if there were any developments regarding Andrew Caldwell's disappearance. Doyle admitted they had new leads. Footprints at the old orchard site suggested someone might have been buried or exhumed there in the not-too-distant past. This implied a potential link to Andrew's case. Every revelation layered more complexity on a story that had begun as a simple real estate purchase. Yet Rosalind felt no regret, only the gravity of her responsibility. One crisp morning, Sheriff Doyle brought a forensic anthropologist and a small, specialized team to the orchard. Rosalind and Frank watched from the perimeter, hearts racing as the investigators paced methodically. At the far end stood a dilapidated shed that had once stored farming equipment. From a distance, it appeared no different from the rest of the neglected outbuildings, but the ground-penetrating radar alerted them to anomalies below the surface. Soon, the team began to dig carefully in a corner of the orchard. Rosalind couldn't bear to watch every shovel turn, so she walked the perimeter, lost in thought. Greenwood Valley Farm had become a patchwork of heartbreak, overgrown lavender fields that once symbolized promise, a hidden room with documents of betrayal, a centuries-old angel statue marking the grave of a murdered heiress, and now the orchard potentially concealing another terrible secret. After about an hour, a deputy signaled Sheriff Doyle. The hush that fell over the team told Rosalind they had found something. She approached slowly, her stomach in knots. The anthropologist was crouched in the shallow pit, brushing away dirt from what looked like a set of human remains. A second body. Questions hammered Rosalind's mind. Was this Andrew Caldwell? Had he met the same fate as his grandmother? All because he dared to uncover the truth. The official identification would take time, but the initial reaction from the team suggested a male skeleton, likely decades younger than Edith Caldwell. The orchard scene was handled with great care. Photographs and measurements taken from every angle. Several small, personal effects, buttons from a shirt, a rusted keyring were bagged for evidence. Sheriff Doyle's normally stoic face showed a flicker of sorrow. This was no longer just an old scandal. It was a multi-generational tragedy that spanned 70 years. Meanwhile, rumors abounded that Leonard Waring had filed legal motions to claim partial ownership of any Caldwell and Waring documentation found on the property. He was trying to argue that the locked box of letters, if it turned up, rightfully belonged to his family's corporate archives. "We can't let him get hold of that," Frank said, wiping his brow anxiously. "He'll bury the evidence just like they buried these poor souls." At night, Rosalind found it hard to sleep. She wandered the house, casting her flashlight along the corridors, listening to the old timbers groan. Each time she passed the door to the hidden stairway, she felt an urge to descend again, to see if she might have missed a final clue or note from Edith. But a deeper part of her dreaded what else she might discover, some further proof of human cruelty. The next day, however, brought a glimmer of light amid the darkness. A forensic genealogist identified genetic matches to the Caldwell family line from the orchard remains. Preliminary conclusion: the body belonged to Andrew Caldwell. If anything, the tragedy underscored the sinister pattern both grandmother and grandson murdered, likely because they stood against corruption. The question remained, who was behind Andrew's murder if Leonard was just a child or teenager at the time Andrew vanished? Could it be associates or hired men protecting the Waring family legacy? Rosalind felt her determination solidify. She would see this through, for Edith and Andrew, and for Greenwood Valley Farm itself. A breakthrough came unexpectedly when a local historian, Dr. Beatrice Ung, reached out to Rosalind. Dr. Ung had studied the Caldwell and Waring archives at the county courthouse years ago. She still had some old notes and microfilm scans, including partial ledgers that might link Davis Waring's embezzlement to multiple shell companies. Most intriguingly, she had stumbled upon a cryptic letter from Davis to an unknown recipient, referencing a final arrangement for East C, dated just days before Edith disappeared. Over tea in Rosalind's makeshift living room, most furniture still draped in protective sheets, Dr. Ung spread out photocopies of the letter. It's incomplete, but the text strongly suggests he was planning to remove her as an obstacle. Dr. Ung explained, "Now that you've found remains under the angel statue, it seems horrifyingly literal." The letter also referenced a joint venture with another business entity in a larger city. "You see," Dr. Ung continued, tapping her pen against the paper, "if Davis needed help to silence Edith, he might have brought in external enforcers, people who weren't from Greenwood Valley. That would explain why no local soul ever admitted to seeing Edith's final hours." Sheriff Doyle later confirmed that new evidence pointed to Davis Waring orchestrating Edith's murder, but the chain of complicity likely continued down the generations. Documents discovered on Leonard Waring's computer indicated he had been actively searching for Caldwell ledgers and hidden Caldwell archives. Possibly, Leonard or his associates learned that Andrew Caldwell was close to uncovering enough proof to tarnish the Waring legacy, which could lead to lawsuits or even criminal charges. Andrew's disappearance then might be no coincidence. The tension in the county soared as lawyers became involved. Leonard Waring threatened lawsuits against Rosalind for trespassing on private corporate property. A bizarre claim that hinged on the notion that the Caldwell and Waring files were Waring family assets. Thankfully, the judge dismissed such an injunction, stating that Greenwood Valley Farm had been legitimately purchased by Rosalind, and any relevant evidence would be handled by law enforcement. By this point, reporters no longer just circled the driveway, they were staked out in hotels nearby, filing daily updates that splashed across local and sometimes national news. 70-year-old murder mystery exhumed. Read one headline, another blared. Sinister legacy of power and greed haunts. Local widow. Rosalind tried to tune it out. She spent her days focusing on restoring the lavender fields, aided by a few volunteers. The slow, methodical work of clearing debris and planting fresh seedlings offered a counterweight to the chaos. Occasionally, neighbors dropped by to show support or share stories. Some remembered visiting the Caldwell farm as children when Edith's new hybrid lavender was in its prime. An elderly woman recalled how sweet Edith had been, giving away bundles of lavender to families struggling through the post-war years. These anecdotes reminded Rosalind that beneath the tragedy lay a legacy of kindness and innovation. Edith had tried to do good, and Andrew's quest for justice carried that spirit forward. If Greenwood Valley Farm was to be saved, it was not just from physical decay, but from the shadow of wrongdoing that had darkened its past. With the help of Dr. Sheriff Doyle pieced together enough evidence to secure an indictment against Leonard Waring for conspiracy to commit murder in Andrew Caldwell's death. That charge, plus potential fraud and obstruction counts, made headlines across the region. Leonard's arrest was dramatic. Television crews filmed as uniformed officers escorted him out of his office in handcuffs. The older residents of Greenwood Valley, who remembered the once revered Waring name, were left reeling. In the wake of Leonard's downfall, more people came forward, adding pieces to the puzzle. A former secretary at Caldwell and Waring confessed that she had witnessed a confrontation between Andrew and Leonard before Andrew vanished. She overheard threats about taking matters into my own hands and was paid off to remain silent. Another tip led investigators to an abandoned storage unit in the next county, where additional Caldwell and Waring records lay hidden. Many of those records corroborated Edith Caldwell's fears of embezzlement and implicated Davis Waring in a pattern of laundering money through shell companies. Amid all this legal turmoil, Rosalind found her own life changed in a quieter, more personal way. Every day she woke to the silhouette of Greenwood Valley Farm under the morning sun. She felt a renewed purpose. The heartbreak etched into this land did not belong to her alone. It belonged to history. Yet she was now part of that history, determined to honor those who had been silenced. She immersed herself in planning the farm's future. The orchard would be cleared of debris, the battered shed rebuilt into a small museum to display Edith's horticultural achievements. The hidden room, after the police finished their documentation, would be transformed into a curated exhibit, preserving the trunk, the journals, and the letters testament to how truth can lie hidden for decades before bursting into the open. On a crisp afternoon, she and Frank took a break from organizing the stable area to walk among the lavender rows. They had cut back many of the dead plants, preparing the soil for new growth. Yet, small shoots of lavender were sprouting, as if beckoned by hope. "You've done wonders here," Frank remarked, brushing a hand over the soft leaves. I can almost see old Edith smiling, seeing her beloved fields come back. Rosalind smiled gently, feeling the warmth of the sun on her shoulders despite the chilly air. "I like to think so," she said. "It's been a dark journey, unearthing all these secrets. But maybe that's how new life begins, breaking through the old, tangled roots." In truth, she had also found a companion in Frank, who seemed more like a steadfast partner each day. They shared dinners now, swapped stories about their younger selves, and found solace in each other's calm presence. Meanwhile, the sheriff's team completed the delicate task of exhuming and identifying Andrew Caldwell's remains. Arrangements were made for a small memorial service, and several of Andrew's distant cousins planned to attend. Rosalind and Frank offered Greenwood Valley Farm as the site for the service, feeling it only fitting that Andrew's memory be honored where he had labored so long to seek the truth. As winter's chill waned into the first mild days of spring, the entire county seemed abuzz with conversation about the upcoming memorial at Greenwood Valley Farm. Rosalind spent her mornings on small repairs, fixing loose boards on the porch, painting over scratches in the hallway, and her afternoons sorting through the final trove of Caldwell letters, many of which had been recovered from the ransacked box, found abandoned in a ditch nearby. Fortunately, most pages were still intact, albeit a bit muddied. She discovered a poignant series of letters between Edith and her best friend, explaining her excitement about the new hybrid lavender she was perfecting. The final letter, dated just days before Edith vanished, struck a heartbreaking note. "I have to confront Davis. I cannot ignore what I've found. If anything happens to me, promise you'll tell Andrew the truth when he's old enough." It was a mother's plea, underscored by a trembling hand. Rosalind confided in Frank that she'd been having dreams about Edith, dreams in which Edith walked through the lavender fields, looking both determined and fearful, calling for Andrew in a voice that sounded both near and far. "It feels like she's guiding us to finish what she started," Rosalind said softly, her eyes damp with emotion. Frank squeezed her hand, telling her that sometimes unsettled spirits found solace when the living set their stories right. The Memorial Day arrived bright and windy. A local pastor presided over a modest gathering beneath the farm's ancient oak tree. Sheriff Doyle attended in plain clothes, standing with the other mourners who gathered to honor Andrew Caldwell, at last identified, at last remembered. A framed photograph of Andrew stood on a small table, next to a photograph of Edith, their faces side by side, bridging 7 decades of unanswered questions. The service was simple but profound. A handful of Andrew's distant cousins spoke about how he had dedicated much of his life to investigating his grandmother's disappearance. Rosalind listened, heart aching for a family she had never met before stepping into this land. Andrew's cousin, a soft-spoken man named Peter Caldwell, thanked her personally for her tenacity. "We owe you a great debt for unveiling the truth," he said, his voice trembling. "At least now we know where Andrew is, where Edith is. They're at peace after the memorial." The group shared a quiet luncheon on the farmhouse porch. The mood was subdued but also somewhat hopeful, as if by acknowledging the tragedy, they could finally start to move forward. Sheriff Doyle confirmed that with Leonard Waring in custody and more evidence surfacing, the legal system was well on its way to delivering justice, albeit decades late. "A lot of folks never thought we'd see the day," she remarked. "This might be one of the county's biggest revelations in living memory." That evening, when everyone had gone, Rosalind found herself alone again on the back porch, reflecting on how an old woman who came here merely seeking a late-in-life project had instead become enmeshed in the final chapter of a multi-generational saga. Yet, she felt neither regret nor fear. Instead, she felt deeply privileged to have helped Edith's voice echo across time, ensuring that the Caldwell name would be remembered for innovation and courage rather than just tragedy. The wind that swept across the fields carried the faint scent of lavender, a promise of renewal. In the weeks that followed, Rosalind threw herself into restoring Greenwood Valley Farm with a vigor that belied her 72 years. She hired local artisans to repair the stained glass windows in the West Wing, commissioned a landscaper to re-establish the original paths winding through the lavender fields, and even set up a small greenhouse where she could nurture seedlings of Edith Caldwell's prized hybrid variety. Offered her expertise in historical horticulture, providing tips on reviving heirloom plants that Edith once cultivated. News of the property's transformation spread, drawing curious visitors. Some came to pay respects to Edith and Andrew, others to see the newly revealed hidden room, which Rosalind had carefully preserved. Tourists marveled at the trunk of documents, the carefully displayed ledger books, and the chronological timeline that Frank had helped assemble along one wall. They read how Edith had been a visionary, combining botanical science with business acumen, how she had stood up against financial corruption, and how her grandson Andrew paid the ultimate price for seeking justice. Local schools requested field trips, hoping to use the farm's story as a lesson in history, ethics, and the resilience of truth. Children walked wide-eyed through the West Wing exhibit, then out into the fields to see the budding lavender. Rosalind made sure to keep the story age-appropriate, focusing on Edith's accomplishments and the importance of honesty and perseverance. Yet the gravity of the tragedy was never entirely omitted. "We must learn from past mistakes," she told one group of teenagers, Cover-ups can hide the truth for a time, but it finds a way to emerge, eventually. Sheriff Doyle, now something of a local hero, helped orchestrate a small ceremony wherein the remains of Edith Caldwell were finally laid to rest in a proper grave near the angel statue, this time with an official headstone. The county had passed a resolution honoring Edith's legacy as a pioneering horticulturalist. That day, Rosalind watched with misty eyes as a wreath of freshly cut lavender was placed by the grave. Dappled sunlight fell upon the scene, and for once the air felt light a wrong had been acknowledged, if not fully rectified. Meanwhile, Frank Whitmore became an increasingly close companion. He'd often joke, I'm just hanging around to see how this soap opera ends. But Rosalind sensed deeper feelings. Both of them had lost spouses and cherished the opportunity to find late-in-life companionship. Friends teased them about wedding bells, but neither was in a hurry to define their bond content, instead to enjoy the simple pleasures of shared meals, quiet porch conversations, and the mutual goal of seeing Greenwood Valley Farm thrive again. One evening, after a full day of repairing a collapsed fence at the property's edge, they sat sipping iced tea. The sun cast an amber glow over the fields, revealing rows of lavender that had been coaxed back to health. Funny how life takes turns we never see coming, Frank mused. You set out to fix up a farm, and you ended up unraveling a 70-year-old murder. Now look at this place. It's come back from the dead. Same as the story. Rosalind nodded, feeling an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the journey. Despite its hardships, we can't undo the tragedy, she said, but we can honor it by continuing what Edith began and letting people see the farm's true beauty. As summer approached, Greenwood Valley Farm truly bloomed. The once barren fields burst with rows of flourishing lavender, attracting bees, butterflies, and delighted visitors. Rosalind decided to host a grand reopening event, inviting the local community and beyond to celebrate the farm's new chapter. She hired a small folk band to play under the shade of the ancient oak, arranged vendor stalls selling lavender-infused products, and organized guided tours of the restored farmhouse. The Hidden Room exhibit drew the largest crowd. People waited in a polite queue to descend the narrow stairs. Frank, who had become adept at storytelling, stood near the entrance, narrating the cautionary tale of how secrets fester in the dark and how perseverance and honesty can illuminate them. Some folks emerged from the exhibit visibly moved, dabbing at their eyes after reading Edith's journal or seeing the photograph of Andrew Caldwell. A few longtime residents admitted they had suspected something foul all those years, but never dared voice it. During the opening ceremony, Rosalind thanked the volunteers, historians, neighbors, and law enforcement officers who helped bring the story to light. Sheriff Doyle spoke briefly about the importance of never giving up on cold cases, while Dr. Ong highlighted Edith's horticultural genius. The air was festive yet reverent, an unusual blend of joy and respect for a legacy forged in adversity. Midway through the festivities, Peter Caldwell, Andrew's cousin, approached the podium. He was not a natural public speaker. His voice trembled slightly as he shared how the Caldwell family had scattered across the country after the farm's decline, never knowing the full truth of Edith's disappearance. We told stories of her brilliance, he said, swallowing a lump in his throat, but we had no idea how bravely she fought to protect her business and her integrity. Now, thanks to all of you, we can finally honor her memory properly. We're indebted to Mel Parker for what she's accomplished here. A gentle wave of applause followed, and Rosalind blinked back tears. Later, as she wandered among the stalls, greeting visitors and sampling lavender honey, Rosalind felt an unspoken kinship with the farmland. Like her, it had endured loss, loneliness, and near oblivion. Yet both had found a second chance to stand strong. She caught Frank's eye from across the way, and he tipped his hat with a grin. That small gesture felt like an affirmation of everything she had done, everything she had risked. The day ended with music and dancing under strings of fairy lights. People of all ages, from curious teenagers to silver-haired couples, joined in an impromptu waltz. At some point, Frank coaxed Rosalind into a slow dance. She laughed nervously, admitting it had been decades since she last danced in public. Yet as they swayed among the lavender's lingering scent, she felt a warmth she had almost forgotten, a quiet happiness in the midst of a community gathered under the open sky. In that moment, the tragedies of the past were commemorated rather than hidden. The farm was alive with renewed purpose, and Rosalind herself felt a contentment that made her believe in life's capacity for gentle rebirth. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation of Greenwood Valley Farm remained a beacon of hope in the county. The official trials against Leonard Waring and his co-conspirators advanced swiftly, armed with overwhelming evidence from Edith's journals, the recovered letters, and newly discovered corporate records. A series of courtroom revelations confirmed what Rosalind and many others had suspected: the murder of Edith Caldwell had been orchestrated by Davis Waring to hide embezzlement. And decades later, Leonard Waring had conspired to silence Andrew Caldwell for the same reason. Justice finally caught up with them both, though the wheels of the legal system turned slowly. Rosalind followed the news with a composed sense of closure. She testified once, describing how she uncovered the hidden room in the documents. Standing in the witness box, she felt strangely calm, answering questions with the clarity of someone who had spent a lifetime curating facts in a library. The judge praised her tenacity, and the prosecuting attorney commended her willingness to protect and preserve the evidence. Back at the farm, life continued. School buses frequently arrived, unloading wide-eyed students eager to learn about horticulture and local history. The farm's little museum area, including the hidden room, became an immersive lesson in the perils of greed and the power of perseverance. High school seniors sometimes wrote essays on the case, citing it as a turning point in the community's understanding of its own past. Dr. Even collaborated with Rosalind on a short scholarly paper about Edith's groundbreaking lavender hybrid, which was published in a regional journal. One afternoon, while Rosalind was tending to the greenhouse, she received a letter from a horticultural society in France, praising the distinctive aroma and color of the Caldwell lavender. They expressed interest in obtaining seeds, hinting that Edith's legacy could spread beyond America's borders. The thought of Edith's dream traveling overseas brought tears of pride to Rosalind's eyes. In her personal life, she found contentment she had not expected at her age. Carol and Keith visited more often, sometimes bringing the grandchildren who loved exploring the haunted secret room, as they playfully called it. Frank, too, had become a cherished fixture in her life. Though they were both set in their ways, they often talked of sharing the farmhouse's big rooms more permanently, or at least spending cold winter nights together in front of the hearth, reading old books while the wind whistled outside. Neither rushed the matter. There was a sweet comfort in simply knowing that neither faced the future alone. Occasionally, Rosalind would sit in the orchard near the statue of the angel, reflecting on the Caldwell family tragedy. She might place a small bouquet of lavender at Edith's headstone or say a silent prayer for Andrew. In those quiet moments, she felt the weight of history and the resilience of the human spirit. The farm had been a place of secrecy and sorrow, but it was also a place of rebirth, a living testament that truth, once unearthed, could not be buried again. As twilight fell, she would wander back inside, the farmhouse's windows glowing in warm lamplight. That once forsaken structure now thrummed with life guests, volunteers, children's laughter echoing from the barn. Sometimes, she caught her reflection in a window pane and hardly recognized the determined woman staring back, silver-haired and smiling. Greenwood Valley Farm had restored more than just a legacy. It had restored a sense of purpose in her own life. And as she locked up each night, she carried within her the unshakable conviction that no matter how deep the dark, a steadfast heart could bring hidden truths back into the light.